Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the revenue of firms, and you mustn't confuse the idea that what we've done in the first year is the market, that's all firms together, and this is now looking at what one firm are going to receive in the market. And we need to consider three things, and the first one is the total revenue. That's all of the value of their sales, sometimes it's called turnover. We need to consider what we call average revenue, and that's the revenue that they get from selling one unit. Sometimes that's called the unit price. And marginal revenue, which is the extra revenue, the change in revenue that they get when they sell one more or one less. So we need to go through that, and you need to understand how you can work that out and show it on a diagram as well. Get good definitions here. Okay, so standard sort of diagram, market, demand here, supply here, this is the price, there's your quantity. So the total revenue is going to be the price per good, the price that you sell a good for, times the quantity that is sold. So in any particular market, you work out the price. Now, sometimes that can be difficult because there's lots of different products, so you can just make the assumption that this is a firm that is selling one product into the market. Don't have to do that. You can sort of look at the average price if you like, but it's the price for one good times the quantity that is sold, and therefore you get the idea that the total revenue received by the firm can be that box there, price times quantity. Okay, now average revenue, here is a demand curve, and we're going to turn this into an average revenue curve, or we're going to be able to call it average revenue. And the reason is that if you think that the average revenue is going to be the total divided by the quantity, so total revenue, all the value of their sales, divided by the number that they sell, and if total is price times quantity, then you can see that if you have price times quantity divided by quantity, you can cross the two quantities out, and average revenue is always the price of the good in the market. So when we talk about the average revenue curve, it is the demand curve, because the demand curve, if you remember from year one, is the curve that, or the line, or the relationship between the quantity that's being sold and the price in the market. So instead of saying that, now you say it's the relationship between the quantity being sold and the price, or the average revenue that the firm is receiving. So average revenue always equals price. Okay, so for your diagrams then, you now draw average revenue curve, quantity at point A, the average revenue is the price, and the total revenues can simply be read from that diagram. This is what you've got to do when you get to the theory of the firm. You've got to find out the quantity that the firm is going to produce, and then you can work out this here is the value, the total value of the revenue, the amount of revenue, total revenue that the firm is going to get at that quantity by selling it at that price. So this is the relationship between total revenue and average revenue. Now, marginal revenue is a slightly more difficult concept, but it's something that you've got to work with now, and most of economics is actually based on what we call the margin. We operate on the margin. So the marginal revenue is defined as the extra revenue from selling one more good, or you can argue it's one less good as well. So how much more revenue do I get if a firm sells one more good? Now, obviously, in real life, that's very difficult to think about, because for most firms, they just sell another good and they get the price. But you're going to see that it's slightly more complicated than that when it comes to the theory that we have to build. So it's the change in the total revenue divided by the change in the quantity. So that's your definition here of marginal revenue, and that quantity, as I say, could be going up or going down. Okay, so it's the change in TR divided by the change in quantity. Now, the best way to actually see what's happening to marginal revenue is simply to draw up a table of data. So let's say we put the price up in the market at £12 and we don't sell any, total revenue is 0. There's no marginal revenue because there's no change in the quantity. But let's say the firm wants to increase the quantity, and so it drops the price to 10 and it sells 20 units. So by dropping the price, you can see a downward sloping demand curve. The quantity has gone up. The total revenue, therefore, is 200. So the marginal revenue is the change in the total revenue plus 200 divided by the change in the quantity. So you won't necessarily get quantity 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. It might go up in 20s. In this case, it is. So you simply take the change in the total, divide by the change in the quantity, and you get that the marginal revenue is plus £10. In other words, at this point, the firm has received £10 more for every unit they've received, they've increased their quantity by. So they've increased the quantity and they're getting £10 more per unit, per one. Let's say they've got to drop the price again to get that increase in quantity. Now, when you then look at the total revenue now, you can see that it's 320. So what's the change in the total revenue? Well, it's gone from 200 to 320. So it's gone up by 120. Divide by the increase in the quantity, the change in the quantity over here. So plus 20. That gives you an answer of plus 6. So by dropping the price, the total revenue is going up, but the extra revenue for every one, which was 10, is now 6. Let's go on. Let's say you want to sell some more. So you drop the price and you get the extra 20 units. So now we see that the total revenue is 360. These two numbers multiply together. The increase in the total revenue is now 40. Divide by the extra 20, you're now getting £2 more per unit that is sold. Okay, so what you're spotting is that when you have, and you'll see this in a minute, this is a straight line demand curve, the marginal revenue will be positive at this, over this range anyway, but it will start to fall. The extra revenue the firm are getting is getting smaller and smaller until you reach this point here when you drop the price again. Now you get 320 revenue, so you've actually had a reduction in your revenue. So your marginal revenue is now minus £2. So for every one that you're selling, you're getting £2 less marginal revenue. Okay, and you can go on and go on, and because of this relationship, because it's a straight line demand curve, this is a very funny technicality in economics, you'll find that the marginal revenue, which was positive, now becomes negative. But you may have to work these tables out in a multi-choice question in the exam. So what does that look like? Well, here is a straight line demand curve, and I've just put in for you between 0 and 20, 20 to 40, etc. I'll bring up the table again. The idea that the marginal revenue are these red dots here. So you can see that the between 0 and 20, so between 0 here and 20 here, we just put the marginal revenue between those 2 points. The marginal revenue is £10. Now, when you keep dropping the price here to sell more, your marginal revenue is going down and going down. It's still positive, so you're still adding to revenue, but it is going down. And so therefore, point A is there, point B is there, C is there, D is there, and on you go to point E as well. So these marginal revenues, these points here, are referring to those points there. Now, we therefore draw in our marginal revenue curve, and you can see that it starts positive, but it ends up negative. This is a always going to happen if you have a straight line demand curve, and in reality that's not very useful, because you're saying, well, why would you keep producing if your marginal revenue is negative? So it's just a funny technicality because of the straight line demand curve. Okay, now in the exam you can just simply draw it. You don't need to prove why that is the case. Okay, so if, however, you want to link total revenue and marginal revenue, just as I said previously, you can look at the average revenue curve, find the box under it. Then can you see that the total revenue here goes up, 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 and then it starts to go down, down, down. Okay, and there's a relationship. So when the marginal revenue is positive, okay, the total revenue, which will start at 0 down here, is also going to be rising. And initially it rises by a lot, but now it rises here by a smaller amount and a smaller amount. So as you drop the price, the marginal revenue is positive, but the total revenue will therefore rise, but it will be rising at a slower rate. And there it is. So this is the total revenue curve that is derived really from finding the marginal revenue, the increase in revenue each time you drop the price, and you'll find that the total revenue goes up. But when the marginal revenue's gone negative, I hope you can see, total revenue will start to fall. So total revenue, marginal revenue, you need to understand this relationship. We measure it on a different axis because obviously if you look at the total revenue, we've got to get up to 360 up here somewhere, and the price is 12. So if you tried to do that on the same axis, you wouldn't see the average revenue curve. But the total revenue rises whenever the marginal revenue is positive, then total revenue starts to fall when marginal revenue is negative. And you need to understand that relationship in multi-choice questions. Usually I rarely see them in essay-based questions. Okay, so as I say, the peak of total revenue is up there at 360. So overall, this is what we're saying, is that you can say the total revenue starts at 0, it goes up to 360, and then it comes back down to 0. So your total revenue is that curve there, and that's how it relates to average and marginal revenue. Now, it's a complicated diagram. Honestly, you're never going to use that in your essay work. It's there for multi-choice work usually. Okay. All right, so as I say, there's your maximum total revenue. But if you think about it, if a firm is trying to increase its revenue, doesn't care about profits, because I haven't mentioned cost yet, then it will keep dropping the price as long as the marginal revenue is positive. That's one thing that you can always say. As long as marginal revenue is positive, if the firm are only a revenue maximizer, then they can keep dropping the price and find that their revenue goes up. Okay, last thing we need to do is consider the total revenue and the PED. Now, this is a recap, hopefully, of your AS material. Now, whenever the price drops, there are two effects. You have lost, for these 4p down to 3p, you were selling at 1,000, you're selling 1,000 units there, you lose 1 pence on each of those thousands. So this is always called, this box here is a loss box. Whenever something's gone down on the axis, that gives you your loss box. But the reason you did it was to increase your sales. So therefore, you have a gain box. So this box here is gained by the company in terms of its revenue. So it's lost this revenue, but it's gained that revenue. And so you can always work it out, as I say, here's the gain box because that's gone up on the axis, and here will be a loss box. So this is doing this for you for a fall in the price and an increase in the quantity, which is the best way to explain this. Now, what happens to total revenue then if price falls to raise this quantity? Well, hopefully from last year you looked at these two diagrams, you have an elastic and an inelastic curve here, or line, and the loss box, when it's elastic, is quite small compared to the gain box because there's a much greater proportionate change in demand, and so your total revenue is going to rise. Whereas with an inelastic, your loss box is going to be much bigger than your gain box, so your total revenue is going to fall. Okay, so that can now be related to what is happening in the diagram we've just been going through, and the syllabus asks us to do this with you, that as we drop the price, and therefore there's this gain in the quantity, initially maybe here with elastic, we would say total revenue is rising, but if it's inelastic, total revenue is falling. Or if total revenue is rising, then that's an elastic demand, and if total revenue is falling, it's inelastic price elasticity of demand, PED. Okay, so remember that, because this is just what happens when price rises, but that is just a reminder, nothing to do with what we need to do here. So what's happening here? So here we have again our average revenue and our marginal revenue. So as we are dropping the price here to increase this quantity, can you see that the marginal revenue is positive? So if the marginal revenue is positive, the total revenue will rise, and therefore at this point here, this demand curve must have an elastic PED because of what we've just said before. Okay, so this range here is elastic PED, but it does stop here. So you can drop your price, increase your quantity, because the marginal revenue is positive, this portion of the demand curve is elastic. However, when you go on over this range, your marginal revenue is negative. So marginal revenue is now turned negative. So as you drop your price from here, any point from here down, okay, I've just shown this one, any point down here, your marginal revenue is negative, and therefore, because of that, the total revenue is going to fall, which means that over this range of a demand curve, you have inelastic PED. So summarizing, you have the idea that over this range, PED is elastic, over this range, PED is inelastic. So where does that put you in terms of just drawing a demand curve, which we've drawn previously and just said, oh, that's an elastic demand curve? Technically, the PED of a straight line demand curve changes over the whole of that curve. It changes from being elastic to inelastic. If you're not doing multi-choice work on this section of the course, you really don't need to worry about that. Okay, the examiner is quite happy that you just draw an elastic looking and an inelastic looking curve. Okay, so you don't need to worry. So basically, finally, the diagram that you use when we're coming to now look at the theory of the firm is this one here. You put in an average revenue curve because it's the demand curve that is facing the individual firm. You will say, okay, and we'll go on to this next. Let's say the firm is producing at Q0. I can now work out that the price is up here, okay, and this is the total revenue. And one thing to point out at this point is that the marginal revenue for any straight line demand curve, the marginal revenue at any quantity is going to be below the price. That is essential that you get that, because we're going to use that later on when we're looking at efficiencies and that sort of thing. Okay, and I won't confuse this video with that, but hopefully you can see that for any straight line downward sloping demand curve, here's the price, here's the marginal revenue. Okay, and that's the diagram that you've got to use.